Hello everyone, Brandon here, and today we will be taking a look at a James Alsop video where he attempts to explain why the alt-right, despite being collectivists, are actually not totalitarian. That's a tough sell, but we'll see. Before we start the video, we must define collectivism. So, collectivism is a political or economic theory advancing collective control, especially over production and distribution. That sure sounds like socialism to me, and if you look at Richard Spencer's ideas on economics, then that makes a whole lot of sense. It also makes sense when we take into account his views on free speech, in that it will not be a thing in the ethno-state.
Like many of you have, I'm sure, I have been eagerly watching the debate saga, the drama going on YouTube between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer and others, with most of it taking place on Andy Worski's Worski Live channel. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in Sargon of Akkad's political opinions. I don't claim to be an expert on Sargon of Akkad's history of debate. I've watched a few of his videos, not very much. He's not really my typical type of content creator. But I do have an interest in this debate because I think it is a very important conversation that's taking place now on YouTube. Now, this is not a scripted video. This is going to be more free-flowing than my other videos, but I do have a list of principles and points here that I do want to get to in this short little video here. So basically, Sargon of Akkad, for those of you who don't know, is known as an anti-SJW. He's known as someone who goes after the feminists, who goes after the Black Lives Matter supporters. And these people he goes after usually in his videos are collectivists for some interest group. Feminists are collective. Black Lives Matter supporters are collective. They have a collective interest in their group's success and in their group's position. Now, through the symmetric property, what Sargon of Akkad does is he says if A equals B, then B equals A. So if these SJWs are collectivists, the symmetric property then dictates that B equals A, and collectivists are SJWs. Now, this is the framework with which Sargon uses when debating or dismissing the alt-right Nazis. Because the alt-right, to Sargon, believes in the power of collectives, they equal SJWs.
This is a straw man. Sargon actually commented on the video saying that James did not understand his argument on collectivism. Alsop is either misrepresenting or, what's more likely, just can't understand Sargon's actual argument. So he boils it down to simple transitivity, when in reality, Sargon's argument is that a collective state will always lead to a totalitarian state, necessarily. More on that later, though.
Now, this is the framework with which Sargon uses when debating or dismissing the alt-right Nazis. Because the alt-right, to Sargon, believes in the power of collectives, they equal SJWs. We see this phrase thrown around all over YouTube by people who think they're just very, very highly intelligent. The alt-right are right-wing SJWs. Now, of course, this is naive. It's sort of autistic, in fact.
I don't think James knows how autism works, but okay.
It overlooks the fact that alt-right and nationalists, they oppose everything SJWs want. Mass migration, affirmative action, feminism, etc.
Just because the alt-right opposes mass immigration doesn't mean they are basically just SJWs. And the reason is that SJWs are collectivists, and those of the alt-right are also collectivists. That's Sargon's point. He does not care what the collectivists are advocating for because it doesn't matter. If the collectivists are advocating for people to brush their teeth, they are still bad. Even if brushing your teeth is objectively a good thing, all collectivists are bad.
Right? They may both be collectivists, but that doesn't mean they're two sides of the same coin. It doesn't mean the horseshoe theory is correct. It's this dopey horseshoe theory that says because they oppose each other, they're the same. Ha ha ha. Well, by this logic, feminists and MRAs are the same because they both talk about gender. Democrats and Republicans are the same because they both talk about tax plans, etc.
Further proof that James has no comprehension of Sargon's actual argument. I repeat, all collectivists, no matter what they want, are bad.
Now, Sargon, in his debate with Richard Spencer, presents individualism as incompatible with the ethno-state. Now, the assumption that many people make, including Sargon, is that the idea of an ethno-state is synonymous with full communism. It's synonymous with state control over everything, the end of free speech, the end of private property, the ethno-state, the power of the race reigns supreme, and individuals are only viewed as ants. They're only viewed as cogs in the success of the collective. Now, you don't even have to be a supporter of the ethno-state to see that that is ridiculous, right? There are ethno-states worldwide that respect individual rights. You can look at Norway, you can look at Israel, you can look at Japan, you can look at Lithuania, Estonia, and dozens of other countries are all effectively ethnostates. They're 90+% homogenous. In the case of Japan, Japan is 99.3, I believe, percent Japanese, or maybe it's 93.9. It's one of the two. It's above 90% homogenous. So these are effectively ethnostates. These countries are effectively ethnostates, but they still protect the rights of individuals. In Japan, everyone is not working in some matrix-type cubicle and giving up all of their individual rights and sacrificing all of their autonomy for the good of the state and for the good of the people. It just doesn't happen that way. Sargon's individualist argument against ethnostates isn't unique to ethnostates. The argument he's making is that individuals will have to make sacrifices for the good of the state, and that is somehow unacceptable to Sargon. Of course, that argument can be used against any state. The argument that state power and that state compulsion of an individual to do something, for example, to pay taxes, that's an argument that anarcho-capitalists and ANCAPs voluntarists, they make against all government. This is an argument made by anarchists against any form of government, that taxes are a form of violence because if I don't pay the taxes, then I am thrown in prison, for example. Now, interestingly enough, Sargon doesn't make these arguments against the UK government or the US government. These aren't the arguments he uses against either of these governments. His complaints with the UK government, like he said in his stream with Medicare, is children being taught about transgenderism, for example. Well, a real believer in the idea that state power is violence, which is the argument Sargon's making, would say that public education at all is state violence because it compels people to educate their children, which they may not want to do. It compels people to pay taxes for schools, which they may not want to do. So, interestingly enough, Sargon doesn't make the ANCAP argument here. It's because Sargon is tactically ANCAP. Sargon is tactically anarcho-capitalist. He's anarcho-capitalist when he needs to oppose the ethno-state. But he's a center-left liberal when talking about every other issue.
I actually agree. Sargon is kind of being a hypocrite here. As far as I can tell, he is a social liberal. So he's fine with high taxes in order to pay for education, health services, etc. But he also wants the state to not infringe on the rights of the individual. Those aren't really two things that you can hold together. Either you don't want the state to infringe on the rights of individuals, in that taxation is basically theft, or you want them to do that. Pick one.
It's a disingenuous argument to make. And the last part of this saga is that Sargon's realization that, yes, collectivism is powerful and can be a good thing. After getting pushed around by Richard in this debate, he took to Facebook and made himself a new Facebook group called the Liberalists. A group of people pushing for their agenda. Isn't that kind of like a collective? It seems a little bit hypocritical, and that's because it is. But the argument and response that individualists and liberalists give, and that Sargon gave in his stream with Mr. Medicare, which I will link below, is that it isn't hypocritical for people to band together to advocate for their shared values. Now, this same justification can be made for people supporting an ethno-state. If liberalists want to say it isn't hypocritical for people to band together, it isn't bad for people to band together to support individualism, you could say the same thing for a group of people, a homogenous group of people, banding together to support an ethno-state.
The difference between the liberalist movement and the alt-right is that liberalists get to choose to be liberalists, while individuals do not get to choose their race. There's nothing wrong with a group of individuals forming a collective as long as they are part of that group by choice. The ability to choose one's group allows for a collective that cannot infringe on personal rights. Because of a situation where the group is opposed to the individual arises, the individual can simply leave the group. I cannot stop being white, so to define me based on my skin color is to force me into a collective.
Collectives are more powerful than individuals, and by creating this group and deciding on a new label and a new philosophy and website for this group, Sargon is actually admitting this. Sargon is admitting the power of the collective. Sargon is admitting that the individual is not powerful against the collective, and that by organizing as a collective, you can have more power and gain more influence and exert your will better than a group of individuals.
James, are you just stupid? If you are, then sorry. I really shouldn't be making this video about you, but you do seem to be somewhat intelligent. Of course a collective is stronger than an individual, but Sargon's argument is not that they aren't. What he's saying is that to be forced into a collective is bad, not that collectives are weak. A collective based on something irrelevant like race or eye color is bad. However, a voluntary collective based on shared values can be a very powerful tool to the individuals within that group.
The collective is a necessary condition here. The funny thing is, his position is entirely self-inflicted. I wouldn't be using this critique against someone who is, for example, a Black Lives Matter supporter, right? I couldn't critique a genuine leftist with this because they admit that collectivism is a good thing. They admit that collectivism is the will to power, is the way you achieve power. But Sargon is stuck in this position where he has pigeonholed himself as being the guy who opposes collectivism, as being the guy who is a champion of the individual against SJW alt-right Nazi collectivism. But he can't have it both ways. He can't have it both ways. He refuses to acknowledge alt-right arguments honestly. And this is the bigger thing. He refuses to acknowledge alt-right arguments honestly. Instead, he tries to fit the round peg in the square hole and compare the alt-right to SJWs, despite the two groups having completely different and competing ideologies. And within that constructed framework, this is how Sargon has pigeonholed himself. He now wants to build a collective of liberalists to fight against the collective of the alt-right by making arguments about how collectivism is immoral and state action is violence, but only if that state is an ethno-state. You see where this is going? It's simply not a tenable position.
Collectivists are the same and just as bad as other collectivists. The alt-right is actually part of the extreme left. They just don't know it.
Sargon's argument now seems to be that political collectivism is okay for him. It's okay to advance the cause of individualism with collectivism, but it's not okay for feminists, SJWs, Black Lives Matter, nationalists, the alt-right, or any other collective that isn't the liberalists. It's hypocritical on its face. It's essentially hypocritical.
The reason the alt-right is an issue while the liberalists are not is because the alt-right wants the state to judge individuals based on race at all. The result would be treating individuals differently based on characteristics that they simply cannot change. Advocating for the ethno-state requires the state to see non-whites as inferior to whites, at least in some way, while the liberalists would advocate for the state to judge individuals based only on merit. It is this desire to be treated as part of an ethnic collective, coupled with their would-be disastrous economic policies, that makes the alt-right part of the racist left.
And again, I believe the bigger issue here, because it's kind of a gotcha to say, oh, well, Sargon, you want to end collectivism, you want individualism, but you also want to have your collective. That's sort of a gotcha. The bigger issue with Sargon is that he refuses to debate the alt-right honestly. He refuses to honestly debate alt-right ideas, instead relying on his individual versus collective framework. And that individualist versus collective framework is a framework he has already stepped outside the bounds of by establishing his collective. So we'll see where he goes from this. It's not a good argument. Even his fans are saying his argument here is not good. It logically doesn't fly. And you can see how he logically arrives to it, right? With the transitive property that he uses, A equals B, B equals C, the symmetric property. But it's not valid. It simply is not valid. It's simply an oversimplification and a very juvenile and simplistic way of looking at collectivism versus individualism. So,
now I want to go into what I believe Sargon's argument to actually be. Collectivism is, by definition, authoritarian. If an individual within a collectivist state does not wish to abide by the rules of the collective, they are dealt with as though they are in the wrong by default. If the rights of the individual are valued less than the collective decision of the group, then the individual must be oppressed for the good of the many. The ultimate extension of this idea is indeed a totalitarian state that must make sure each individual follows the collective. An example: if the collective decides that a stadium is to be built in a location that is currently owned by an individual, then the individual must abide by the state's decision. If said individual does not want to sell or give up their land, then the collective must punish the individual by either forcing them to sell at a price that the state decides, or by just taking the land. After all, it is the good of the collective that matters, not the rights of the individual. If the rights of the individual do not supersede the desires of the collective, then how can we even say that rights exist within this framework? In truth, the only collective states are authoritarian ones. An example that applies to the alt-right would be immigration. Imagine a high IQ black potential immigrant and a lower IQ white potential immigrant. Assume these individuals are identical in all their aspects, just to keep this simple. An individualist state would look at both applicants and most likely take in the black immigrant, who will provide a higher than average level of productivity, while the white ethnostate will see the color of the individuals and take the white applicant. Which country is better off? Would you take James Alsop or Thomas Sowell? That's an easy choice for me.